26th of December, 1943. The German battleship Scharnhorst is at sea for the last time, hunting an Allied convoy, and she does not yet know that the convoy is bait. She is one of the fastest and most powerful warships afloat, a ship that sank a British carrier, tore apart Atlantic convoys, and ran the English Channel in daylight and lived. But a British fleet is closing in around her through the snow, guided by a weapon she cannot match, and within hours, the ship that always outran her enemies will be hunted down in the dark and sent to the bottom with almost every man aboard. This is the story of the ship built to raid and run, the victories that made her feared across 2 oceans, and the single weakness that ran her down in the end. Before the war, Scharnhorst carried an argument in her very design, and it is one that has never entirely been settled. To this day, people cannot agree on what kind of ship she actually was. Germany called her a battleship. The British, then, and often since, called her a battle cruiser. It comes from the way she was built. A battleship of her era was expected to carry guns of 14 or 15 inches. Scharnhorst carried guns of 11 inches, noticeably lighter than the weapons of almost every enemy capital ship she might meet. In that respect, she looked like a battle cruiser, a ship that trades gunpowder for speed. But a battle cruiser also traded away armor, and Scharnhorst did not. She was armored like a true battleship, with a belt of Krupp steel more than a foot thick in places, heavy enough to shrug off punishment that would have gutted a lightly built ship. So she was a puzzle. Battleship protection, battleship speed, but a cruiser's main gun. Depending on which quality you fixed on, you could call her either thing, and people have argued about it for 80 years. The light guns were a deliberate choice, and the usual explanation is a political one. When she was designed in the mid-1930s, Germany was still emerging from the disarmament imposed after the First World War, and there was reason not to alarm Britain and France with a ship openly armed like a first-class battleship. 11-inch guns drew less attention. The intention, it is said, was always to replace them later with 15-inch guns in twin turrets, the same found on the Bismarck class, upgrading her into the battleship she was laid out to become. That refit never came. Scharnhorst went through her entire career undergunned for her size, able to out-armor and outrun her enemies, but unable to match their heaviest fire, and in the end, that gap would matter. She was laid down at Wilhelmshaven in 1935 and launched in October 1936, with Hitler himself present to watch. She measured 770 feet, displaced around 38,000 tons at full load, and on her trials, she made better than 31 knots, extraordinarily fast for so large a ship. She carried her 9 11-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft, and a crew that in her final form numbered nearly 2,000 men. She was fast, hard to sink, and beautiful in the cold way that warships can be. She was also, from the beginning, plagued by trouble in her engines, a high-pressure steam plant that was powerful when it worked and broke down often. On paper, she was one of the finest ships afloat. In practice, she spent a great deal of her life in dockyards. Scharnhorst went to war as a commerce raider, a fast ship meant to break out into the open ocean, fall upon Allied shipping, and vanish again before heavier forces could catch her. Her first blood came in November 1939 in the North Atlantic, when she and her sister Gneisenau came upon the Rawalpindi, a passenger liner that the British had armed with a few old guns and sent out to patrol. It was a hopelessly one-sided meeting. The Rawalpindi was a merchant ship in all but name, facing 2 modern warships, and her captain knew it and fought anyway. She was smashed to a burning wreck and went down with most of her crew, having scored, at best, a single hit in reply. It was a grim demonstration of what these ships could do to anything that was not built to fight them. The following summer, off the coast of Norway, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau found something far more valuable. On the 8th of June 1940, they caught the British aircraft carrier, Glorious, and her 2 escorting destroyers in the open sea, unprepared, with no aircraft ready to fly. Scharnhorst opened fire at enormous range and struck Glorious with one of the longest range gunnery hits ever recorded from one moving ship to another, tearing open the carrier's flight deck and ending any hope of her launching aircraft. Glorious and both her destroyers were sunk, and more than 1,500 British sailors died. But the victory was not clean. One of the destroyers, Acasta, turned back into the German fire and put a torpedo into Scharnhorst before she went down, and that single torpedo did real damage, killed dozens of men, and sent Scharnhorst limping to Norway and then into months of repair. Even at the height of her success, a ship a fraction of her size had made her pay. The peak of her raiding career came early in 1941, in an operation the Germans called Berlin. Under Admiral Günther Lütjens, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau broke out into the Atlantic and spent 2 months loose among the convoy routes, sinking or capturing 22 Allied merchant ships, well over 100,000 tons of shipping. It was exactly the kind of campaign the ships had been built for, and it caused real alarm in Britain. But the operation also revealed the flaw that ran underneath all of Scharnhorst's power. Twice during the cruise, the German ships came upon convoys guarded by old British battleships, slow veterans of the First World War, but ships that carried 15-inch guns. And twice, Lütjens, under strict orders not to risk his ships against enemy capital ships, turned away and declined the fight. 2 of the most modern warships in the world ran from single obsolete battleships because those battleships carried guns that could hurt them and Scharnhorst's could not reply in kind. The raider was formidable against the weak and forbidden to fight the strong. By the end of the Atlantic cruise, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were sheltering at Brest on the occupied coast of France, and there they became a problem for their own side. The Royal Air Force bombed them steadily, the harbour was a trap, and the German command decided to bring the ships home to Germany. The safe route ran the long way around the British Isles. Instead, they chose the boldest possible course. They would go straight up the English Channel, through the narrow waters between England and occupied France, past the enemy's front door in daylight. In February 1942, in an operation the Germans named Cerberus and the British remember bitterly as the Channel Dash, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen ran the length of the channel with a heavy escort of aircraft and destroyers. It should have been suicidal. The channel was the most heavily defended stretch of water in the world. But the Germans achieved surprise, jammed the British radar, and slipped into the strait before the defenders understood what was happening, and the attacks that came were piecemeal and disorganized. A handful of obsolete British torpedo aircraft attacked with suicidal courage and were annihilated. Their leader awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for pressing home an attack he knew he could not survive. Coastal guns and destroyers and bombers all tried and all failed. Both battleships struck mines during the passage, but both reached German ports. It was a humiliation for Britain, enemy capital ships steaming through the channel in broad daylight for the first time in centuries, and the newspapers treated it as a disaster. And yet, in the longer view, it was the Germans who had retreated. The Channel Dash pulled Scharnhorst and her consorts out of the Atlantic for good. The bold dash home was, in truth, the end of the German surface raiding war, dressed up as a triumph. Scharnhorst's last chapter was written in the far north. After repairs, she was sent to Norway to join the great battleship Tirpitz, and from the fjords of the Arctic, the 2 ships menaced the convoys that carried Allied supplies to the Soviet Union. They did not have to do much to be dangerous. The mere existence of Scharnhorst and Tirpitz in northern Norway forced the British to guard every Russian convoy with heavy ships held in reserve against the chance that the Germans might come out. The fear of these ships shaped the entire Arctic campaign, and on at least one terrible occasion, the fear alone was enough to cause a catastrophe, when a convoy was scattered on the mistaken belief that Tirpitz was at sea and was destroyed piecemeal as a result. Scharnhorst spent 1943 as one half of that threat, sortying once to bombard an Allied weather and radio station on the Arctic island of Spitsbergen, an operation in which her gunnery was reportedly poor, but otherwise lying in the fjords, a danger simply by being there. By the end of 1943, that role was almost all she had left, and she was increasingly alone in it. British midget submarines had crept into the fjords and crippled Tirpitz, putting the larger ship out of action. The German heavy cruisers had been pulled back to the Baltic. The Luftwaffe in the north was a shadow of what it had been, and the U-boats had been mostly mastered at this point. Scharnhorst was the only heavy ship the Germans had left in Norway that could still strike a convoy. And, with the German armies in full retreat on the Eastern Front, the pressure to do something, to strike one blow against the supplies flowing to Russia, grew heavy. When a convoy was detected heading east just after Christmas, the decision was made to send Scharnhorst out against it. What the Germans did not know was that the convoy was bait and that the trap was already closing. The British had detected Scharnhorst's likely sortie and prepared for it. The convoy, 19 merchant ships bound for Russia, was the lure. Waiting to spring the trap were two forces. To the east were three cruisers under Vice Admiral Robert Burnett, the Belfast, Norfolk, and Sheffield. And to the southwest, further off but closing, was the heavy force under Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, built around the Battleship Duke of York, with the cruiser Jamaica and a screen of destroyers. Fraser's plan was simple and deadly. He would use the convoy to draw Scharnhorst in, and catch her between his forces and her own base in the dark, and destroy her with radar-directed gunfire before she ever saw him. Scharnhorst sailed on Christmas Day under Rear Admiral Eric Bay, with the ship herself commanded by Captain Fritz Hinze, and 5 destroyers in company. She sailed into a rising Arctic gale, and the weather began to work against the Germans at once. The storm grounded the German reconnaissance aircraft, so that Bay went out blind, with no eyes in the sky to tell him what lay ahead. Then the heavy seas made the destroyers nearly useless, and when Bay sent them off to search for the convoy, they lost contact with Scharnhorst in the murk, and never found her again. By the middle of the morning, the most powerful ship in the north was alone, without her escort, in a snowstorm, hunting for a convoy that was hunting her. Just after 9 o'clock in the morning, Burnett's cruisers found her first, by radar, in the darkness. They opened fire, and in the exchange, a British shell struck Scharnhorst forward and destroyed her main radar. In an instant, she was blinded. The snow was thick, the polar night was black, and now she had lost the instrument that let her see and shoot through it. Her gunners were reduced to aiming at the flashes of the British guns, and even that was made harder, because the British cruisers were firing a flashless propellant that gave them little away. She was faster than the cruisers, and Bay used that speed to try to swing around them and reach the convoy. Twice he made the attempt, and twice Burnett, judging what Bay intended, placed his cruisers back between Scharnhorst and the merchant ships and blocked her. In the second of these clashes, Scharnhorst hit the Norfolk hard, knocking out one of her turrets and her radar. But Bay had had enough of fighting blind against an enemy he could not properly find. He broke off and turned south, running for home and for the safety of the Norwegian coast. And running south took him straight toward Fraser and the Duke of York, whose radar had been tracking the whole engagement from beyond the horizon. Scharnhorst had no idea the British battleship was there. The cruiser Belfast, shadowing her by radar in the dark, fed Fraser her position, and the trap closed around a ship that could not see it. A little before 10 to 5 in the evening, in complete darkness, the Belfast fired a star shell, and its harsh light hung over the sea and lit up Scharnhorst for the guns of the Duke of York. The British battleship opened fire at close range for a night action, under 12,000 yards, and hit with her very first salvo. Her 14-inch shells smashed into Scharnhorst's 2 forward turrets and put them out of action, cutting away much of her firepower in a matter of moments. Even then, she was not finished, and the fight that followed was long and hard. Scharnhorst turned and ran east at high speed, still dangerous, her remaining guns firing back into the dark. One of her shells struck the Duke of York's mast and knocked out the British battleship's gunnery radar, and for a few minutes, the Hunter herself was blinded. An electrical officer climbed the mast in the howling gale, under fire, and worked the aerial back into place, and the Duke of York's radar came back to life, and with it, the deadly accuracy of her guns. Scharnhorst's speed was her last hope, and she was slowly drawing away when a single shell from the Duke of York, fired at very long range, plunged down through her armoured deck and destroyed one of her boiler rooms. Her speed collapsed. Temporary repairs brought her partly back, but the damage was done. She could no longer outrun her pursuers, and now they closed in from every side. Bay signalled his command that they would fight to the last shell. It was the truth. Scharnhorst fought on as the British destroyers raced in through the darkness and the heavy seas and fired their torpedoes into her, wave after wave of them. The British ships and the Norwegian destroyer Stord among them, driving home their attacks at close range. Torpedo after torpedo struck her, and her speed died away to nothing. and the Duke of York and the cruisers poured shellfire into her burning hull. She would not sink easily. She took a punishment that would have destroyed most ships many times over, still firing, still underway, until at last, a little before 8 o'clock in the evening, she rolled over and went down by the bow, her propellers still turning, north of the North Cape. Of the nearly 2,000 men aboard her, 36 were pulled alive from the freezing sea. Both Admiral Bay and Captain Hintzer died with the ship. That evening, aboard the Duke of York, Admiral Fraser spoke to his officers about the enemy they had just destroyed. He told them that if any of them were ever called upon to fight a ship against hopeless odds, as Scharnhorst had been fought that day, he hoped they would command their ships as gallantly as she had been commanded. It was a rare thing, an admiral honouring the enemy he had just sent to the bottom, and it was deserved. Scharnhorst had gone down fighting a battle she could not win, blinded, alone, and outnumbered, and she had made her enemies work for every hit. Her destruction was a turning point. With Scharnhorst gone and Tirpitz crippled, the German surface threat in the north was effectively over, and the convoys to Russia could sail without the shadow that had hung over them for 2 years. The heavy British forces that had been tied down guarding against a German sortie could at last be released for other work. The fear that had scattered whole convoys was lifted. The Battle of the North Cape was the last time British and German capital ships fought each other with their big guns. It was fought almost entirely in the dark, without aircraft on either side, a throwback to an older kind of war at the very end of the age when battleships decided anything. And it carried a hard lesson that the German Navy itself understood at once. Scharnhorst should have been able to use her speed and the foul weather to escape, or to fight on something like even terms, and instead she had been destroyed. The commander of the German Navy drew the obvious conclusion afterward that a surface ship without effective radar could no longer fight at all. Scharnhorst had proved it with her own destruction. She had been built to raid the oceans and run from anything stronger, and for a few years she had done exactly that, feared from the coast of Norway to the sea lanes of the Atlantic. In the end, she was sent out one last time against an enemy who had learned to see in the dark, and her speed and her armour and her courage could not save her, because she had been struck blind at the start and hunted down before she ever understood how completely she had been trapped. Of the nearly 2,000 men who had sailed in her, only 36 were pulled alive from the freezing Barents Sea. The ship that had always outrun her enemies, in the end, could not outrun this.